Here's what doesn't add up about the Medici. The richest family in Europe. 4 popes, 2 queens, 3 centuries running Florence. The easy story is that money bought all of it, but here's the strange part. Cosimo de Medici, the man who started it, had enough money to seize Florence outright, and refused. No crown, no title, he ruled from the shadows and lived like he was nobody. If power is for sale and you won't buy it, then power was never the thing you wanted. So what was? The version we all got handed is that the Medici were the ultimate example of money buying everything. Bankers who got rich then used the cash to purchase a city, a dynasty, and eventually the papacy itself. Power for sale, and they were the highest bidders. That's the story. But it falls apart the moment you look at how Cosimo actually behaved. Usually, a man who wants power displays it. He takes the title. He sits on the throne. He wants everyone to see exactly how high he's climbed. Cosimo did none of that. He held no formal office most of his life. He wore plain clothes. He walked the streets of Florence like an ordinary citizen. When he pulled the strings of the entire republic, he did it through friends, loans, and quiet favors, never from a seat of obvious command. That's not the behavior of someone buying power. Power was the easy part. He could afford that on a Tuesday. He was buying something much harder to get, something money alone has never been able to purchase. And to understand what it was, you have to understand what the Medici actually were underneath the fortune, because it wasn't flattering. They were moneylenders, and in 15th century Florence, that was close to being damned. The Medici fortune was built on banking, and banking ran on interest, and interest was usury, and usury was a sin. It wasn't a metaphor for a sin, an actual one, condemned by the church, the kind that could send your soul to hell. Dante had put usurers in the 7th circle. The whole moral architecture of the age said that what the Medici did for a living was spiritually filthy. They worked around it with clever accounting, disguising interest as currency exchange, but everyone knew. You could be the wealthiest man in the city and still be, in the eyes of God and your neighbors, a man who got rich off something shameful. The old aristocracy had bloodlines, land, honor, names that went back centuries. The Medici had cash and a stain. A stain they would spend the next 300 years trying to paint over. And here's the detail that turns the whole thing almost unbearable in its irony. The Medici became the official bankers to the Pope. The single richest account in their entire operation was the church itself. So they were profiting enormously off the very institution that taught the world their profits were a sin. They were getting wealthy by financing the people who could decide whether they went to heaven. Think about what that does to a person. You are richer than kings, and you cannot buy the one thing the poorest, honest farmer already owns: a clean conscience and a secure place in the world to come. The church holds your money in one hand and your salvation in the other. Cosimo inherited all of it: the bank, the fortune, and the stain that came with it. And according to the people who knew him, the stain weighed on him. A biographer of the era recorded that Cosimo was genuinely anxious about how he'd made his money, worried about the state of his soul, aware that no amount of gold had made him clean. Now, we can't climb inside a dead man's head and measure his guilt exactly, but watch what he does next, because his actions say more than any confession could. He finds an answer to the problem, and the answer is the most brilliant move the family ever made. He starts giving the money away, visibly, magnificently, everywhere. But not as charity in the quiet sense. Cosimo pours his fortune into beauty. He rebuilds the Church of San Lorenzo. He funds the monastery of San Marco and has its walls covered in frescoes by Fra Angelico. He bankrolls Donatello. He collects ancient manuscripts and builds one of the first public libraries Europe had seen since the fall of Rome. He underwrites the revival of Greek philosophy, the rediscovery of Plato, and the entire intellectual engine that we now call the Renaissance. So this is what the Medici were buying. Not power. Power was just the leftover. They were buying their way out of being moneylenders. They were buying legitimacy they could never inherit, love they could never demand, and absolution they could never earn through banking alone. They treated their fortune like a stain they could never wash out. So instead, they painted over it. Again and again, with the most beautiful images the world had ever produced, until the painting became so magnificent that everyone forgot there was ever a stain underneath. Florence gave Cosimo a title when he died. Not king, not duke. They carved it on his tomb. Pater Patriae, father of the country. The moneylender's son had bought his way into being the father of an entire people. It looked like it had worked perfectly. But here's the question that should be growing in the back of your mind. If beauty really could buy you safety, legitimacy, and a clean soul, then why did it end the way it did? Because the painting couldn't protect them. And the place where that truth arrives is almost too cruel to be real. By the time Cosimo's grandson Lorenzo ran the family, the strategy had become the entire identity. Lorenzo the Magnificent was the greatest patron of them all. The young Michelangelo lived in his household and ate at his table. Botticelli painted under his protection. Lorenzo wasn't just laundering a stain anymore. He genuinely loved the beauty, lived for it, breathed it. And while he was busy being magnificent, the bank, the actual source of everything, was rotting underneath him. Branches failed. Managers cheated. Lorenzo, distracted by art and politics, let the engine that powered the whole machine fall into disrepair, and even reached into funds that weren't his to keep it all afloat. The family had become so good at converting money into glory that they forgot to keep making the money. But the real reckoning came in the cathedral. In 1478, a rival family called the Pazzi, with the quiet blessing of people very high in the church, decided to end the Medici for good. And the place they chose to do it was Florence Cathedral, during High Mass. At the most sacred moment of the service, as the bells rang, the assassins struck. Think about where this is happening. The Medici had spent 3 generations and a fortune buying their way into the good graces of God and the Church. They had filled the holy spaces of Florence with beauty as a down payment on their souls. And now, inside one of those very holy spaces, at the altar during the Mass, men came to murder them. Lorenzo's younger brother Giuliano was stabbed 19 times and died on the cathedral floor. Lorenzo himself, slashed across the neck, barely escaped, locked himself in the sacristy, and survived. All that beauty, all that sacred art, all those churches funded with laundered gold, and it bought them exactly nothing in the one moment it might have mattered. The cathedral didn't protect them. It was the trap. The very holiness they had purchased became the room where they were meant to die. The thing they thought they were buying, safety, belonging, a place so sacred no one could touch them, was never actually for sale. They'd bought the appearance of it. The world had simply let them believe the appearance was the real thing, right up until the knives came out at the altar. So let's go back to the start. The Medici didn't buy power. What did they buy? I think they bought forgiveness, or at least they spent their whole existence trying to. They were men who'd been told by their own world that the source of everything they had was a sin, and they could not bear it. So they took the thing they were ashamed of and they converted it relentlessly into the most beautiful and holy objects they could commission, hoping that if the output was sacred enough, no one would ask too hard about the input, including, maybe, God. And here's the strange, almost unbearable truth at the center of it. In one sense, it failed completely. It didn't make them safe. Giuliano still died on the cathedral floor. It didn't even necessarily clean their souls, because guilt like that doesn't take a receipt. But in another sense, it worked beyond anything Cosimo could have imagined. Because we don't remember the Medici as moneylenders. We don't remember them as usurers damned by the church. 500 years later, the stain is completely gone. We remember them as the family that gave the world the Renaissance, the patrons of Michelangelo and Botticelli and Donatello. The painting they put over the stain became so beautiful that history itself forgot there was ever anything underneath. They couldn't buy forgiveness from God. They couldn't buy it from the men who killed Giuliano. But they bought it from us, from everyone who came after, who looks at what they left behind and feels only awe. And maybe that's the most human thing about the whole story. Every one of us has some version of where we came from that we'd rather not look at too closely. The Medici just had more money than anyone in history to paint over theirs. They turned their shame into the most beautiful thing the world had ever seen. And in doing so, they bought the only kind of immortality that ever really lasts. Not the kind where you're powerful, the kind history grants you, and you can never grant yourself.